Wilhelmina Grady had buried 2 men before she turned 32, and she had hammered the last nail into the lid of her own heart right alongside the last nail in each of their coffins. The town of Caldwell, Kansas, in the autumn of 1882, was not a gentle place for a woman who had known grief twice over. It sat on the edge of the Kishom Trail like a knot on a rope, necessary, hard, and impossible to ignore. Cattle drives pushed through its main street with enough regularity that the dust never truly settled, and the smell of livestock and boot leather had seeped so deep into the wooden buildings that no amount of whitewash could drive it out. Saloons outnumbered churches 3-1, and the men who populated those saloons were the sort who had not yet learned the difference between being alive and being reckless. Wilhelmina had learned that difference the hard way twice. Her first husband, Thomas Grady, had been a cattleman from Missouri who came through Caldwell when she was 19 years old and full of dreams she had not yet examined closely enough. He was broad-shouldered, quick to laugh, and generous with his coin. He had proposed to her beneath a cottonwood tree on a Sunday evening in May, and she had said yes before he even finished the sentence. They had 7 months together, 7 months of building a life on the edge of the frontier, of laying in provisions for winter and learning each other's moods, and making plans that stretched years into the future. Then a horse threw him in October, and the ground took him in a way that left no room for recovery, and Thomas Grady was lowered into the red Kansas earth while the first frost was still shimmering on the grass. Wilhelmina had grieved deeply but had not broken. She was young, and the people of Caldwell were practical in the way that frontier people had to be practical. Life did not pause for mourning. There were animals to feed and a small parcel of land to maintain, and neighbors who were kind but who also had their own burdens to carry. She put her grief in a room inside herself and locked the door and kept going. Her second husband, Clement Hayward, came along 3 years later. He was a farmer, steady and quiet, a man who expressed his affection through action rather than words, repaired fence posts before she noticed they were leaning, left firewood stacked higher than she asked for, made sure the well rope was always sound. He was safe in all the ways that mattered. She had not loved him with the wild, unreasoning intensity of her first love, but she had loved him truly, in the way that people love things that are solid and dependable and woven into the fabric of every ordinary day. Clement died of a fever in the spring of 1881, 18 months into their marriage. The fever moved through Caldwell like a thief, fast and indiscriminate, and Clement was among 4 men and 2 children it took before the summer heat drove it out. Wilhelmina had stood at his grave on a cold, gray morning in April, and she had made herself a promise that was so clear and so certain in her mind that it felt less like a vow, and more like a fundamental truth about the nature of things. She was done. She was 31 years old, and she had loved and she had lost, and she had grieved until the grieving had carved grooves in her that would never fully smooth out, and she was simply done. Not brokenly, not bitterly. She was not a bitter woman, but with a finality that felt carved from the same hardwood that made up the floors of her house and the handles of her tools. She had the house. She had 30 acres of decent land that she and Clement had worked together. She had a small herd of 6 cattle and a kitchen garden that was the envy of half the women in town. She had her neighbor Dorothea Phelps 3 miles west, and the general store run by old Marcus Webb and the post rider who came through Tuesdays and Fridays. She had enough. She had, as she told Dorothea plainly one afternoon over coffee, more than enough reason to be grateful, and not one single reason to go inviting another man's mortality into her life. Dorothea, who had been married to the same stubborn man for 22 years and still found things to like about him, had smiled at Wilhelmina with a particular kind of patience that Wilhelmina found both touching and insufferable. But she had not argued. Nobody argued with Wilhelmina Grady about matters she had decided. It was simply not the kind of argument you could win. So the autumn of 1882 found Wilhelmina Grady 32 years old, technically a widow twice over, and in possession of a life she had assembled with her own 2 hands and her own considerable will. She rose before dawn every morning and was in bed before full dark. She kept a rifle over the door and knew how to use it. She baked bread on Thursdays and did her accounts on Sundays, and drove herself into Caldwell every 2 weeks in her wagon for supplies. She was, by all external measures, doing extremely well. The problem, though Wilhelmina would not have called it a problem, was the fence line on the eastern edge of her property. The land east of hers had been empty for the better part of 2 years, ever since old Pete Connors had given up on Kansas and gone to live with his daughter in St. Louis. Nobody had bought it in the intervening time. Wilhelmina had thought about buying it herself more than once, but 30 acres was already a considerable undertaking for one woman, and there were only so many hours in a day. So the eastern land had sat idle, and the fence line between the 2 properties had slowly begun to deteriorate in the way that all things deteriorate when nobody is attending to them. Then, in October of 1882, someone bought the Connors land. She found out about it the way she found out about most things, from Marcus Webb at the general store, who heard everything that moved through Caldwell before anyone else did. She had come in for flour and lamp oil on a Tuesday, and Marcus had leaned across his counter with the particular gleam in his eye that meant he had news he considered worthwhile. Somebody bought the Connors place, he told her. New man, came in 2 days ago to file the deed. What kind of new man? Wilhelmina asked, because in Caldwell the kind mattered. Rancher type, from Colorado, he said. Name of Donnelly, Walter Donnelly. Marcus paused in the way he always did when he had more to say. Quiet fellow, polite, paid cash, which Governor Hayes over at the land office said was the nicest thing he'd seen in 6 months. Wilhelmina had considered this information with the detachment she applied to most things. A new neighbor was a new neighbor. She would not be unfriendly. She would also not be particularly interested. She loaded her flour and her lamp oil into the wagon and drove home, and gave Walter Donnelly no further thought for approximately 4 days, which was exactly how long it took for Walter Donnelly to knock on her front door. He knocked at 10 in the morning, which was already a point in his favor, because only a man with no sense knocked on a working woman's door before 8 or after dark. She opened the door and found a man standing on her porch that was, in the first and purely involuntary fraction of a second, before she could organize her thoughts properly, startlingly good-looking in a completely unpretentious way. He was 35 or 36, she guessed, with a face that had been weathered by years of outdoor work into something that was less handsome by the standard rules and more compelling by every other measure. Strong jaw, dark brown eyes that were steady and direct without being aggressive. He wore a plain gray shirt and dark trousers and a hat that had seen serious use, and he held the hat in his hands with a kind of unconscious courtesy that Wilhelmina noted before she could stop herself from noting it. "Mrs. Grady," he said. His voice was even, unhurried. "I'm Walter Donnelly. I bought the land to your east. I thought I'd come introduce myself before the situation forced it, which in my experience it always does eventually." Wilhelmina regarded him with the calm assessment she applied to everything. "In my experience too," she said. "What situation are you expecting?" The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. "Your fence line, for one. About 200 yards of it is leaning at an angle that is going to become my problem in the spring when I bring in my first cattle, and I'd rather discuss it now than have a dispute over strayed animals later." This was, Wilhelmina had to admit, an unusually practical and reasonable opening. Most men would have simply waited for the cattle to stray and then argued about whose fault it was. "I know about the fence," she said. "I've been meaning to address it." "I'd be glad to help with it," he said immediately. "It runs along both our properties, only fair." She studied him for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, then opened the door a little wider. "I have coffee on," she said. "We can discuss the logistics." This was not, Wilhelmina told herself firmly as she poured 2 cups, any kind of significant moment. It was a property conversation between neighbors. It happened all the time. It meant nothing beyond what it was. Walter Donnelly sat at her kitchen table with the ease of a man who was comfortable in his own body, without being comfortable taking liberties. And he drank his coffee without commenting on how strong it was, which Wilhelmina appreciated because she made her coffee with a conviction that some people found alarming. He looked around her kitchen in the brief, comprehensive way that people do when they are in a new space, not rudely, but with the genuine observational interest of someone who has spent time building their own spaces and therefore understands the work that goes into them. "You've kept this place up well," he said, and it did not come out as flattery. It came out as a statement of fact from a man who knew what keeping a place up well actually required. "I've tried," she said, sitting across from him with her own cup. "How long have you been in Colorado?" 8 years, he said. "Had a small spread outside of Pueblo." "Good land, but the winters were—" He paused and something moved across his face that she could not quite read. "I needed a change of scenery." Wilhelmina did not ask about the pause. She was not yet in the business of asking Walter Donnelly about the things he kept behind pauses. "Kansas winters are not mild," she said. "No," he agreed. "But they're a different kind of hard. I think sometimes a different kind of hard is what a person needs." She looked at him over the rim of her cup and found that he was already looking at her, not in the way that some men looked at her, which was the appraising, calculating look of men who saw a widow with land and thought they understood what that meant. He was looking at her in the way that someone looks at a landscape that is larger and more complicated than they expected, with a kind of careful respect for the scale of it. She looked away first, which she noted. She almost never looked away first. They agreed on the fence. He would bring lumber from the mill in Caldwell. She would provide the tools and the labor of the west side, and they would split the work down the middle. It was sensible and clean and left no room for obligation on either side. He thanked her for the coffee, put his hat back on, and walked back across the field toward the Connors' place, which was still the Connors' place in her mind, even though it was legally his now. Wilhelmina stood on her porch and watched him go for only as long as was necessary to be certain he had gone in the right direction, and then she went back inside and returned to her day. The fence work began the following Monday. Wilhelmina had dealt with enough men in the context of work to know that working alongside someone revealed things about their character faster and more honestly than almost any other interaction. Men who were impatient became impatient within the first hour. Men who cut corners began cutting corners by noon. Men who talked more than they worked revealed that habit in the first 30 minutes. Walter Donnelly worked. That was the first and most straightforward thing about him. He worked with the steady, unhurried efficiency of someone who had been doing physical labor his whole life, and had long ago made his peace with the fact that large tasks require large amounts of time and are not improved by rushing. He did not talk excessively. He offered his opinion when she asked for it, and did not offer it when she did not. When she took down a section of old fencing that he had already loosened on his side, he simply moved to the next post without comment, without the slight pause of a man waiting to be thanked. By the end of the first day they had replaced 40 yards of fence and had spoken perhaps 60 sentences between them, most of which were functional. Drive that post another inch. Twist the wire here. The ground is harder than it looks in this section. When they stopped at the end of the afternoon, Wilhelmina was tired in the clean, satisfying way of honest physical work, and she said she would bring water and bread the following morning since they would be starting at the far end, which was closer to her barn than his house. "I'll bring the coffee," he said. She looked at him. "You know how to make coffee." "I've been making my own coffee for 8 years," he said. "I can manage." She made a non-committal sound that was not an agreement and not a dismissal, and he left. And she went inside and began her evening routine, and she did not think about him. Except that she did think about him, which she recognized and filed away under the category of things that were interesting but not actionable. the way she filed away interesting things she read in the newspaper or heard in town. It was interesting that he was the way he was. It did not need to be more than that. He arrived the next morning with coffee in a dented tin pot wrapped in flannel to keep it warm, and it was, she had to acknowledge privately and without comment, excellent coffee. Strong without being bitter, which required either good instinct or actual thought, and she was not yet prepared to decide which it was in his case. They worked for 3 days on the fence, and by the end of the third day it was done, a clean, solid line of posts and wire running the full length of the shared boundary, something that would last years if it was maintained. Walter stood back and looked at it with his hands on his hips, and Wilhelmina stood next to him and looked at it too, and there was a moment of shared satisfaction that was so simple and so genuine that she felt it before she could prevent herself from feeling it. "Good work," he said. "It is," she agreed. He looked at her then with the same steady attention he had had in her kitchen, and she had the disconcerting sense that he was not doing arithmetic, not calculating, not measuring, but simply looking at her in the way that people look at something they find genuinely worth looking at. "I'd be glad to buy you supper in town sometime," he said, "by way of thanks for the tools." Wilhelmina had a dozen ways to decline things. She had been declining things politely but absolutely for the better part of 2 years. She selected one and opened her mouth, and what came out instead was, "I am generally free on Saturday evenings." She was as surprised by this as he was, which she could see in the brief, careful shift of his expression, not triumph, nothing so small as that. More like a man who did not entirely trust his luck and was making sure he had heard correctly. "Saturday evening, then," he said, and that was all. She walked back to her house with the deliberate pace of a woman who does not feel any particular way about what has just occurred, and told herself that supper was supper, and it was nothing more than good neighboring, and she was perfectly in control of the situation. Dorothea Phelps came by on Friday morning, as she did most Fridays, and Wilhelmina told her about the supper because it was impossible to keep things from Dorothea, who had a way of looking at you that peeled back pretense the way a good knife peeled bark. Dorothea was quiet for a moment. "Wilhelmina," she said carefully. "It is supper," Wilhelmina said. "Between neighbors." "Of course," Dorothea said, with exactly the same quality of patient smile she had produced 2 years ago when Wilhelmina had made her vow at Clement's grave, and which Wilhelmina had found both touching and insufferable then, and found precisely as touching and insufferable now. "Do not make something of it," Wilhelmina said. "I am not making anything," Dorothea said serenely, and refilled her own coffee cup as if the matter were entirely settled. They ate supper at the Grand Central Hotel dining room on Saturday evening, which was the nicest establishment in Caldwell, and served proper food on real china rather than tin plates. Walter wore a clean dark jacket and had clearly made an effort with his appearance, not in a way that was fussy or anxious, but in a way that communicated he understood this was a specific kind of occasion, and he was treating it accordingly. They talked for 2 hours. This surprised Wilhelmina, who had expected the conversation to be pleasant but mostly about practical things, the land, the cattle market, the state of the coming winter. And it did include those things, but it also moved through other territory at a pace that felt natural rather than effortful. He had grown up in Ohio before going west, the son of a blacksmith. He had gone to Colorado in his mid-20s following a restlessness he described simply as a need to find out what was past the next ridge, which she recognized as a particular kind of honest answer that many men dressed up in more impressive language. He read, which was not universal among men in Caldwell. He had brought a small crate of books with him from Colorado that he mentioned only in passing, when the subject arose naturally. He asked her questions and listened to the answers in a way that was distinct from the way most men listened, which was with half their attention while preparing their next statement. When she spoke, he was quiet in a way that suggested he was actually processing what she said before responding. She told him about her land, about the work she had put into it over the past 2 years. She told him about the kitchen garden in more detail than she had intended to, and he asked specific questions about soil preparation and frost dates that indicated he knew enough about growing things to make the questions genuine rather than polite. She did not tell him about Thomas or Clement. Those stories were hers in a way that required a great deal more trust before she would place them in anyone else's keeping, and she had not established that kind of trust. Not yet. Not yet. She noticed the "not yet" approximately halfway home in her wagon and filed it alongside the other things she was not acting on. November arrived with the sharp efficiency of a Kansas autumn, dropping the temperature overnight and painting the grass in colors that were briefly beautiful before the first hard freeze turned them brown. Wilhelmina's work shifted with the season: more time inside, more preserving and preparing, more attention to the animal's comfort. She had hired a boy from town, 16-year-old Jimmy Falk, for 2 days a week to help with the heavier outdoor work since Clement had died, and Jimmy was reliable and cheerful and required minimal direction. Walter came by twice in November, each time with a practical reason. Once to ask about a water source she had mentioned on the east end of her property, because his own water situation was going to require some thought before the deep freeze. Once to return a small hand sickle she had left at the fence line when they finished the repairs. Each time, she offered coffee. Each time, he stayed for an hour that passed faster than an hour usually did. Each time, she stood on her porch after he rode away on a solid-looking bay horse and stayed there a moment longer than was strictly necessary. She was not falling in love with Walter Donnelly. She was absolutely certain of this. She was enjoying the company of a sensible neighbor who happened to be interesting to talk to, and that was an entirely different and entirely manageable thing. She was also beginning to notice details she had not consciously decided to notice. The way he removed his hat when he stepped inside, without thinking about it. The way he addressed her directly when he had something to say, without preamble or circling. The way his hands looked when he wrapped them around a coffee cup: strong hands, working hands, with a small scar along the outside of the right one that she had not asked about and he had not explained. The way he laughed, which was not a performance but a genuine, unguarded sound that came out of him sometimes when she said something dry and which she discovered she liked producing. None of this was actionable. None of this was anything. In December, he invited her to supper at the Connors at his place, which he made clear he was cooking himself, which she raised an eyebrow at, and which turned out to be a beef stew that was perfectly respectable and served with fresh biscuits that were better than merely respectable. He had done something to the inside of the house that made it feel inhabited rather than occupied: small things, a quilt on the chair by the stove, a stack of books on the table near the window, a lamp positioned in a way that suggested someone had actually thought about where the light should fall. She did not mention any of this, but she looked at it the way she looked at things she was building a picture of. They sat by his stove after supper and talked until the fire needed more wood, and they both noticed simultaneously that it had gotten very late. She drove home in the cold dark, and the stars were extraordinary over the flat Kansas land, and she sat in her wagon and looked at them for a moment before going inside, which was something she had not done in a very long time. Christmas in Caldwell was modest. The church held a service, and the town organized a gathering at the meeting hall that Wilhelmina attended because Dorothea insisted, and because she had apple cake to bring. Walter was there. Dorothea was spectacularly unsurprising in her behavior, positioning herself across the room and watching with the focused benevolence of a woman who has made up her mind about something and is waiting for the universe to catch up. Wilhelmina found Walter near the stove with 2 cups of cider, one of which he offered her with the matter-of-fact ease of someone who had not planned the gesture, but had simply seen her arrive and acted accordingly. "Merry Christmas," he said. "Merry Christmas," she said, and took the cup. They stood together for a while and watched the gathering, the children running between the tables, the older men in their best coats telling stories they had told many times before, the women managing everything with the invisible efficiency that kept frontier life functioning. Caldwell's preacher, Reverend Morris, made a small speech. The Hendricks brothers played fiddle and guitar for 2 hours, and people danced with the abandon of people who did not have many opportunities to dance and intended to make the most of each one. Walter asked her to dance once, toward the end of the evening. She said yes, which again was not what she had intended to say, and he led her onto the floor with a hand at her back that was light and careful and completely proper, and they moved through a reel that required enough attention that she could not simultaneously be thinking about the fact that she was dancing with him, which was possibly why she enjoyed it as much as she did. On the drive back home, alone in her wagon under the winter stars, she had her first completely honest conversation with herself about Walter Donnelly. The honest conversation went like this. She liked him. She liked him in a way that was distinct from how she liked Dorothea or Marcus Webb or Reverend Morris or any other person in her acquaintance. She liked how he thought. She liked how he moved through the world. She liked the specific shape of his company, the way it had a quality that she would have described, if pressed, as peaceful without being dull. Because he was not a dull man. He was in fact a quietly interesting man, but there was nothing in his presence that created anxiety or tension or the low-level unease that some people produced in others without meaning to. Being around him was like being in a well-made room, solid, proportioned, lit correctly, and she was afraid of that. She was not afraid in a general, anxious way. She was afraid in a very specific way, the way a person is afraid when they have lost something important twice, and have looked at the way those losses felt and made a rational decision that the third time they felt that way, something in them would simply not survive it. She was 32 years old and she was not dramatic about it, but she had genuinely calculated, in the practical front-of-mind way she calculated most things, that she did not have another burial in her. She did not have another chapter of grief. She had the capacity for happiness. She knew that, but her capacity for that specific kind of loss had been used up, and she had organized her life accordingly. The stars were very bright and very cold and very far away. She drove home and put her horse in the barn and went to bed and lay looking at the ceiling for an hour before she finally slept. January was cold and sharp and busy with the specific work of winter maintenance, and Wilhelmina was grateful for it. Gratitude for busyness was a skill she had developed long ago and relied on heavily. She repaired a section of her barn roof with Jimmy Falk's help, winterized the kitchen garden, and drove into Caldwell twice for supplies she did not strictly need quite yet but needed an excuse for. She saw Walter in town the second time, in front of Marcus Webb's store. He was loading lumber into his wagon and she was coming out with a bolt of muslin, and they nearly collided on the step, which produced a moment of near fumbling that was so ordinary and unromantic that she felt something in her chest loosen unexpectedly, a small, involuntary softening that she could not justify or organize. "Careful," he said, steadying her elbow 1 second of contact, completely impersonal. "I see you," she said, which was a strange thing to say, and she knew it, and he looked at her with the beginning of that not-quite smile, and she turned it sideways. "The lumber," she said. "I see it. I should have been watching where I was walking." "The step's uneven," he said, with perfect generosity, because the step was not actually uneven. "I keep telling Marcus." She allowed this fiction to serve its purpose, and they stood for a moment in the cold January morning, and there was snow in the air though it had not yet committed to falling. He asked how her barn roof had held, and she told him about the repairs, and he said he had a similar situation developing on his grain shed, and she said she knew where you could get good quality cedar planks without going all the way to Wichita, and they stood there for 12 minutes talking about lumber and construction while the threatened snow finally decided to arrive, small and tentative in the way of winter mornings. "I should get back," she finally said. "So should I," he said. But neither of them moved for a moment, which Wilhelmina recognized and simultaneously refused to acknowledge. She drove home through the light snow and was cross with herself for the rest of the afternoon in a formless, directionless way that she could not attach to anything specific, which was, she recognized, the most honest indicator of all. February brought a proper blizzard, which was not unusual for Kansas, but was always a reminder that nature had no particular investment in human plans. The snow came in on a Thursday and did not stop until Saturday, and by Saturday morning, Wilhelmina had 3 feet of snow against her south door, and a heifer that had decided to give birth at the least convenient possible time. The heifer, whose name was Bess in the unimaginative way that Wilhelmina sometimes named things, had been making clear for 2 days that she was getting close, and Wilhelmina had moved her into the barn with the focused practicality she brought to all animal care. The birth itself was not complicated, but it was long, and by the time the calf arrived on Friday night, small and perfect and immediately determined to stand, Wilhelmina was exhausted in the deep-in-the-bones way of interrupted sleep and sustained attention. She was in the barn Saturday morning, still keeping an eye on Bess and the calf, when she heard someone at the barn door. She had her rifle across her lap out of pure ingrained habit, because 3 feet of snow did not mean the world stopped being what it was, and she set it aside when Walter Donnelly came through the door with snow on his hat and his coat and the expression of a man who has been walking through difficult terrain. "I saw your lamp in the barn last night," he said, "from the hill. I wanted to make sure everything was all right." She looked at him. He had walked or ridden, or both, through 3 feet of snow to check on a light he had seen in her barn from a hill that was at least half a mile from the boundary of his land. He was stamping snow off his boots and looking at Bess and the calf with immediate practical attention. "She delivered last night," Wilhelmina said. "Both of them are fine." "Good." He crouched down and looked at the calf with the experienced eye of a man who knew cattle, and the calf looked back with the slightly bewildered expression of something that has been alive for less than 12 hours and is still working out the details. "Strong little one." "She is," Wilhelmina agreed. She offered him coffee, which she had brought to the barn in a pot because she had known she would be out here for most of the morning. He sat on the low bench near the feed and she sat across from him, and the snow outside made everything quiet in the muffled way of big snowfalls, and the lamp cast a warm orange light over the hay and the animals, and Bess moved slowly and contentedly nearby. It was, objectively, a very ordinary scene. A barn, 2 people, a fire in the lamp, coffee, a new calf. Wilhelmina looked at Walter Donnelly in the lamplight and felt, without permission, without any of the careful barriers she had installed and maintained over the past 2 years, a surge of feeling so clear and so definite that it was almost physical, a recognition as simple and as undeniable as recognizing your own name when someone calls it. She loved him. She had not been falling in love with him. She had, apparently, already been in love with him for some time, and the only new development was that she could no longer successfully argue otherwise. She looked down at her coffee cup and applied herself to it with great concentration. Walter did not notice, or at least gave no sign of noticing, and she was grateful for this because she needed time. She needed to think. She needed to be in her house alone and think clearly about what she was going to do with this information. He stayed for an hour, helped her lay down fresh straw for Bess, and left when the snow had eased enough to make the ride back reasonable. She watched him go from the barn door and then stood for a long time looking at the white, empty landscape and the gray sky and the tracks his horse had made in the deep snow. She had buried Thomas Grady and Clement Hayward. She had stood at 2 graves and felt 2 different shapes of the same devastating loss. She had made a vow that was not melodramatic or theatrical, but was simply the honest conclusion of a woman who knew her own limits. And now here was Walter Donnelly, who walked through blizzards to check on barn lamps, who made excellent coffee and repaired fence lines, and listened when she spoke and had, without her permission or participation, become necessary to her in the particular, irreversible way that people sometimes become necessary. She went inside and sat in her kitchen for a long time. The trouble with vows, Wilhelmina had always believed, was that they were made in specific moments of specific pain, and pain had a way of shaping things into absolutes that the actual texture of living could not always sustain. She did not think less of herself for having made the vow. She understood exactly why she had made it. She understood that the woman who stood at Clement's grave and looked at the cold April sky and said never again was a woman who had been pushed to the absolute frontier of her endurance and had drawn a line there in the only way she could. But she was not, she realized slowly and with a kind of careful honesty, the same woman anymore. She was still Wilhelmina Grady, still practical, still capable, still carrying the marks of what she had survived. But she had spent the past 14 months without quite realizing it, slowly and incrementally becoming someone who had the capacity for this again. Not because the grief had been erased, it had not been and never would be, but because something had grown alongside it, built from ordinary days and honest work, and the particular quiet nourishment of knowing that Walter Donnelly was 3 miles to her east. She was afraid. She was still afraid. The fear was genuine and she did not dismiss it. But she was also 32 years old and alive and sitting in a kitchen that she had built with her own hands and her own choices, and somewhere in the land east of hers, a man had walked through a blizzard to look at a lamp in her barn. She decided to let herself be afraid and do it anyway. The snow cleared by the following Tuesday, and she drove over to Walter's place in her wagon with a fresh loaf of bread wrapped in a cloth, which was a neighborly gesture that she made no attempt to dress up as anything more specific. He came out of the house when he heard the wagon, and she climbed down and handed him the bread and said, with the directness that was one of the fundamental properties of her character, "I think you should know that I appreciate your company." Walter took the bread and looked at her. The winter light was flat and clean, and the land was still white in every direction. "I appreciate yours," he said carefully. "I am not a simple woman," she said. There are things in my history that make me cautious in ways that are probably sometimes inconvenient for other people." "I don't find you inconvenient," he said. "You may," she said, "if you understood what I was saying." He was quiet for a moment. Then, with the same deliberate care he brought to everything, he said, "Mrs. Grady, Wilhelmina, I have been figuring you out since October, and what I have figured out is that you are about the most interesting and capable and genuinely worthwhile person I have met in a very long time." He paused. "I don't scare easily." She looked at him for a moment. "I have been married twice," she said. "I buried both of them. I vowed after the second one that I was done. I meant it completely when I made it." "I know," he said quietly. "Marcus Webb has been in Caldwell longer than most. He mentioned it last fall, not unkindly. He seems fond of you." She absorbed this. "And you came to introduce yourself anyway." "I came because you were my neighbor and it was the right thing to do," he said. "What I thought after I met you was my own problem to manage." Something in her chest moved, slow and certain as a river changing course. "I am still afraid," she told him. "I want to be honest about that." "I think that's about the most reasonable thing I've heard anyone say," he said. He was standing in the snow in front of his house and holding her loaf of bread and looking at her with those steady brown eyes that had been steady since the first morning she opened her door to him. "I'm not asking you for anything right now. I'm just glad you're here." She stayed for 2 hours. They talked about the calf, about his grain shed repairs, about the spring cattle he was planning to bring in. They talked about Ohio and Missouri and the particular quality of grief, which entered the conversation so naturally that she was halfway through saying something real before she realized she had started saying it, something about how loss does not leave a vacancy so much as it changes the shape of the space. And the shape of the space is still there even when you fill it with other things. And sometimes that is fine, and sometimes it surprises you. Walter listened to all of it. He said at the end of a long stretch of quiet that he had not buried anyone but that he had left someone in Colorado, a woman he had been going to marry who had chosen in the end someone else, and that the leaving, while not the same as a burial, had done something to the geography of his expectations that had taken years to properly map. "I'm not comparing it," he said immediately. "I know it's not the same. It is its own shape," she said. "That counts." He looked at her with something she could only call gratitude, and she understood it fully. When she drove home that evening, she felt lighter than she had in 2 years. Not recklessly lighter, not naively so, but with the specific lightness of a person who has put down something heavy that they have been carrying so long they forgot the weight of it. March in Kansas came in with wind and mud and the particular chaos of thawing ground, and Wilhelmina was busy with the kitchen garden preparation, and the calf, who was thriving magnificently, and had been named Birch by Jimmy Falk, who said the white patch on her flank looked like a birch tree, which it did not particularly, but Wilhelmina liked the name, and the general resurgence of activity that spring brought to a working property. Walter came by 3 times in March, and twice she went to his place, and the quality of the time between them shifted in a way that was perceptible without being dramatic. A warmth that had been there all along but had not previously been fully acknowledged, like a lamp turned up half a degree, so that the room is brighter but you cannot precisely identify the moment it changed. He touched her hand once, deliberately, on a Thursday afternoon when they were sitting on her porch looking at the first serious greening of the land. He covered her hand with his for a moment, brief, quiet, a question without words, and she turned her hand over and held his, and they sat like that for a while without saying anything, which was its own kind of answer, its own kind of conversation. She had never been a small gesture person. She did not live in subtleties as a general rule. But she found that with Walter the small things were the ones that carried the most weight, this hand-holding on a spring afternoon, the half-smile that appeared sometimes when she said something he found unexpectedly funny, the way he occasionally appeared in the middle of her field of vision at a moment she had not anticipated, and her entire internal landscape shifted slightly, like a compass needle reorienting. She was in love with him. She had established that in February, and it had not changed. It had grown, in fact, in the quiet, patient way that real things grow, not dramatically but steadily, adding itself to the structure of her days. April brought the anniversary of Clement's death, which Wilhelmina observed privately in her own way, sometime at his grave in the morning, a few honest hours of remembrance. She had developed her own rituals around these things that belonged to her and to the men she had loved and to no one else. She thought about Thomas too, and the young woman she had been when she loved him, and about how grief had been the unexpected education of her adult life, the thing she had not chosen but that had made her who she was with a thoroughness that nothing else had. She was at Clement's grave when she heard a horse and turned to find Walter sitting on his bay, a little way off, his hat in his hands. He had not come close, he was simply there. She looked at him for a moment. "How did you know?" she asked. "I didn't," he said. "I was riding fence and I saw you here and I thought I would just—" He paused, and the pause was different from his usual pauses. This one was softer at the edges. "I can go." "Stay," she said. He dismounted and walked over and stood beside her at the grave, not saying anything, not trying to make it better or different from what it was. Just standing there in the April sun with his hat in his hands, which was the right thing to do and which she noticed. "His name was Clement Hayward," she said after a while. "He was a good man. He was very good at knowing what needed doing before you told him." "That's a real skill," Walter said. "It is." She was quiet for a moment. "Thomas Grady, my first husband, was the kind of person who made every room feel more alive. They were nothing alike, which I have spent a lot of time thinking about. I think maybe I just have. I think people have the capacity for more than one kind of love, and they're all real, even if they're not the same." Walter was quiet for a moment. "Then I think that's true." She turned and looked at him. He was looking at the grave with a respect that was uncomplicated and genuine, and then he looked at her, and in his face was everything she had been looking at for 6 months: the steadiness, the care, the particular quality of his attention, and also something more open than usual, something less managed. "I am not going to stop being afraid," she said. "I want you to understand that. It will not go away." "I'm not asking it to go away," he said. "I'm asking—" He stopped and started again with the care of a man choosing words with actual precision. "I'm asking if you'll let me be here anyway. That's all. Just here." The wind moved through the April grass, and the cottonwoods along the creek were just beginning to show green, and somewhere nearby, a meadowlark was conducting its singular, brilliant argument with the sky. "Yes," she said, "I'll let you be here." He reached out and took her hand in both of his, the same strong, careful hand she had been noticing since October, and held it in the way of something he intended to take care of, and they stood there at Clement Hayward's grave in the spring sunshine, and she felt the complicated, honest truth of it, the grief still present, the love also present, both of them real, neither canceling the other, the fullness of a life that had not taken easy paths but had come to this moment, this field, this man. She had broken her vow. She was aware of that. She did not feel guilty about it, which told her something important. The vow had been made in the darkest hour of her hardest year, and it had served its purpose, had been the wall she needed when she needed a wall. And now the wall was coming down, and what was on the other side of it was Walter Donnelly holding her hand in a Kansas field while a meadowlark argued with the sky. May was glorious and busy. Walter's cattle arrived, 40 head of good Texas Longhorn stock that came up from the south on the trailing season, driven by 3 cowboys he had hired for the purpose, a lean and weathered outfit led by a man named Cross who wore a red kerchief and had the bow-legged walk of someone who had spent the majority of their life on horseback. Wilhelmina watched the cattle arrive from her fence line with the professional appreciation of someone who knew cattle, and she and Walter walked the herd together that evening, checking the stock, and she told him her thoughts on the condition of a few of the animals, and he listened, and then they went back to his house and made a joint supper out of whatever was available in his kitchen, which was her first time cooking in his house, and which turned out to be a stew that was better than either of them could have managed alone, and which they ate on the porch while the long May evening stretched gold across the land. She had not told Dorothea the full extent of things yet, and Dorothea, remarkably, had not pushed, had only continued to wear that patient smile when Wilhelmina mentioned Walter, which she mentioned more often than she had previously been mentioning him. When Wilhelmina finally sat down at Dorothea's kitchen table on a Friday in late May and said plainly, "I am in love with Walter Donnelly," Dorothea set down her mug and smiled the widest smile Wilhelmina had seen on her face in years and said, "I know." And Wilhelmina laughed, actually laughed, a real, unguarded sound that surprised them both, and then covered her mouth and laughed again. "How long have you known?" Wilhelmina asked. "Approximately November," Dorothea said comfortably. "I barely knew myself in November," Wilhelmina said. "I know," Dorothea said. "That's why I didn't say anything." This was, Wilhelmina thought, the best quality Dorothea possessed. She knew when to wait. It was a rare skill, and Wilhelmina was grateful for it. "Are you happy?" Dorothea asked with the directness of a real friend. Wilhelmina sat with the question for a moment. "Yes," she said. "Which is, I know how that sounds, given everything. I'm not saying it carelessly." "I know you're not," Dorothea said. "You don't say anything carelessly." She reached across the table and patted Wilhelmina's hand. "Good, I'm glad. He's a good man." "He is," Wilhelmina agreed, and the simplicity of being able to say it out loud to someone who understood the full context of what it meant, the history, the vow, the long and careful process of changing her mind, was its own kind of relief. Walter asked her formally on an evening in early June. They had spent the afternoon together at her property, because she was extending her kitchen garden, and he had come over to help move some stones that were too heavy to manage well alone, and they had worked until the late afternoon sun went gold, and then sat on her porch with lemonade that she had made because lemons had come in with the supply wagon from Wichita, and she had bought a sack of them with the specific vague intention of making lemonade at some undefined future point. He set down his glass and looked at her in that direct, careful way of his. "Wilhelmina," he said, "I would like to ask you to marry me. I'm aware of everything that comes with that question, and I'm not asking you to put any of it aside. I'm asking you to build something with me anyway." He paused, and in the pause there was a quality she recognized as vulnerability, genuine, unmanaged, the kind of openness that a careful man shows only when he has decided that the person across from him is worth the risk. "I know it's a question that means something different to you than it does to most people. I know what you've carried. I'm asking anyway because I believe you are the most important thing that has happened to me in my adult life, and because I think you might say yes." She looked at him for a long time. The summer evening was warm and the light was still rich at the western horizon, and the smell of the garden came across the porch, green and good, and somewhere in the field a cricket had started early. She thought about Thomas Grady, who had been big and laughing and gone in 7 months. She thought about Clement Hayward, who had been steady and quiet and gone in a spring fever. She thought about the woman she had been at 19, full of unexamined dreams, and the woman at Clement's grave, full of examined conclusions. She thought about barn lamps and blizzards and lumber conversations and spring grass and a hand taken at a graveside. She thought about the vow. She had made a promise to herself that had kept her safe for 2 years. It had served her. She did not regret it. But a vow was not a law and a vow was not a fact. A vow was a woman's promise to herself, and a woman could also, in good conscience and full self-knowledge, decide that she had enough information now to revise the terms. She had not changed what she believed. She still believed that loss was real and that grief was the full and honest price of love, and that the price could be paid more than once if love required it. She was still afraid. The fear was still there. She was also 32 years old in a Kansas summer evening with a man who had walked through a blizzard to check a barn lamp and asked her to marry him by saying he thought she might say yes, which was the most precisely accurate thing anyone had ever said to her. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you, Walter." He let out a long breath that told her more than an entire speech would have about how uncertain he had actually been, and she felt an enormous rush of tenderness for the fact that he had been uncertain, that he had known it was not a simple question, and had asked it anyway with the full understanding that the answer was genuinely in question. He leaned forward and kissed her, which was the first time their lips had met, and it was gentle and certain and right in the specific way that things are right when they have been carefully arrived at rather than rushed into. She held his face in both hands for a moment afterward and looked at him in the June light and felt, with no qualification and no remaining resistance, entirely present in her own life. They were married in September of 1883. A year after Walter Donnelly first knocked on Wilhelmina's door with his hat in his hands, and a conversation about fence lines. Reverend Morris performed the ceremony at the church, which was small and white and sat at the east end of Caldwell's Main Street, with an earnestness that Wilhelmina had always found appealing. Dorothea stood beside Wilhelmina as her witness and cried, which she had announced in advance she would do, and which she did with complete lack of self-consciousness. Marcus Webb was there, and Jimmy Falk in a coat that was slightly too short in the sleeve but had been pressed with evident care, and several other neighbors who had watched the season of this with varying degrees of knowledge and interest. Walter wore a dark coat and a new hat and looked, as Dorothea told Wilhelmina afterward, like a man who understood the magnitude of what was happening and was glad about it in equal measure. Wilhelmina wore a dress she had made herself from a deep blue wool that Dorothea had helped her choose from the bulk goods at Marcus's store, and she had done her dark hair up with the pearl pins that had been her mother's, and she walked into the church with the bearing of a woman who knows exactly what she is doing and has chosen it with open eyes. When Reverend Morris asked if she took Walter Donnelly to be her husband, she said, "I do," with a clarity and fullness that put a different quality of silence in the church for a moment before the Reverend continued. Walter's "I do" was quiet and steady, which was exactly how she would have predicted it and exactly what she wanted. After the ceremony, Caldwell held a small gathering at the meeting hall. The Hendricks brothers played again, and there was good food provided by half a dozen women who understood that feeding people was a form of love, and people danced in the practical, joyful way of frontier people who made the most of every celebration because celebrations were hard-earned and well-deserved. Walter danced with her twice. The second time he said, very quietly near her ear, "How are you doing?" And she knew he meant it in all the ways it could mean, and she pulled back enough to look at him and said, "I am doing very well," and meant it in all the ways that could mean. That night at the house, the Connors place, which was by this time so thoroughly Walter's and, now, hers as well that she had stopped thinking of it as the Connors place. She stood at the window and looked out at the dark Kansas land and thought about all the people she had been, and all the things she had chosen, and all the ways that life had shaped and reshaped her, and she felt the full, honest weight of it without flinching. Walter came and stood behind her and put his arms around her, and she leaned back against him, and they looked at the dark land together. The stars were huge over Kansas when there was no cloud, and there was no cloud tonight. The Milky Way was a river of light across the sky. "I want you to know," she said quietly, "that I know what I'm doing, that this is not something I drifted into or was persuaded into. I am here because I chose to be here, and I know the difference." "I know you do," he said. "That's one of the things about you." She turned in his arms and looked at him. "What things about me?" "The fact that you know your own mind," he said. "Completely. Most people think they know their own minds. You actually do." She studied him. "And that doesn't unsettle you." "It's one of my favorite things about you," he said simply. She kissed him, and the January blizzard and the June lemonade and the fence line in October were all present in it. All the accumulated months of knowing each other, and choosing each other, and arriving at this exact point by a road that had not been easy but had been completely, honestly theirs. They moved between the two houses over the following months in the practical negotiation of two people combining two established lives. Ultimately, they settled in Wilhelmina's house, because it was larger and the kitchen was better, and the land layout suited a combined operation more efficiently than the Connors' house did. Walter rented the Connors' house to a young couple, the Aldridges, who had come west from Illinois in the spring, and needed a place while they got established, which worked out well for everyone. The combined property, 62 acres when you accounted for both parcels, plus a small additional strip that Walter had acquired in the spring, was considerably more workable as a single operation than either had been individually. They were both practical enough to approach the combination methodically, assessing what could be consolidated, what needed to be expanded, where the work was, and how to meet it. Walter brought a careful, strategic mind to the larger picture, and Wilhelmina brought a detailed, precise attention to the day-to-day operations, and these two approaches turned out to complement each other with a neatness that pleased her enormously. Jimmy Falk, who was 17 now, and growing into a serious-minded young man, was taken on more formally as a hand, with proper wages and regular hours, and Walter began teaching him the cattle management that Jimmy had not had previous exposure to. This arrangement suited Jimmy very well, and he took to it with an aptitude that validated the investment. By the spring of 1884, they had expanded the cattle herd to 60 head and begun the process of improving the pasture land on the east section of the combined property, which required moving a great deal of rock and establishing better water access. Walter had found the water source Wilhelmina had mentioned months ago, a reliable underground seep that could be improved into a proper stock pond, and they spent 2 months of that spring doing exactly that: hard work, dirty work, deeply satisfying work. The kind that leaves you tired in the evenings in a way that makes the dinner table and the lamp and the person across from you feel specifically and completely like enough. She knew she was pregnant in June of 1884, and she told Walter on a Tuesday morning while they were eating breakfast, in the direct way she delivered all important information. He set down his fork and looked at her, and the expression that moved across his face was so open and uncalculated that she felt tears come to her eyes, which she had not expected, and she pressed them back with the practiced efficiency of a woman who did not often cry in front of people. "Are you all right?" he asked, and she knew he meant it in all the layered ways again, the pregnancy itself, and also the fact of it, and also what it meant for her to be here again, entering the specific vulnerability of a new life. "I am better than all right," she said, which was true. "I'm going to build a room," he said immediately, then caught himself and looked at her. "If that's, where do you want to put it? You probably already have thoughts about where it should go." She had, in fact, already been thinking about the northeast corner of the house, where the morning sun came in well and which currently functioned as a storage room that could be reorganized. She told him this, and he got up from the table and went to look at the corner with the focused attention of a man who has already moved to the next stage. And she sat at the table and looked at her coffee and felt something move through her that was so full it was almost difficult to contain: gratitude, love, fear, joy, the complicated whole of everything. She went to visit both graves that week. Thomas Grady's stone was on the western edge of Caldwell's churchyard, modest and weathered. Clement Hayward's was on her property, near the cottonwood trees, which is where he had asked to be placed and which felt right. She spent time at each of them and said the things she needed to say, not apologies, because she did not think she owed apologies but acknowledgments, that they had been real and mattered, and that the love she had had for each of them was still present in her, unchanged by whatever had come after, that she was happy. That happiness was not a betrayal of what had been but was, in its own way, a testament to the capacity for it that they had helped her understand. She came home from the second grave to find Walter on the porch, reading, with 2 cups of coffee on the rail, one waiting for her. He looked up and did not ask where she had been, because he knew, and he handed her the coffee, and she sat beside him and they read in the late afternoon quiet while the cattle moved in the field and the new stock pond glittered in the western light. The baby arrived in January of 1885, in the dead of a Kansas winter that had not made any of the months of preparation easy. Dorothea was there, and the local doctor, a young man named Ferris who had come to Caldwell the previous spring, and who proved to be both competent and calm. It was a long labor, as first labors often were, and by the time it was over both Wilhelmina and the doctor were thoroughly tired, and Walter, who had been outside for the relevant portions as was the convention of the time, was wearing a path in the porch floor. The baby was a boy. He was loud from the first moment, which was exactly what you wanted, and healthy, and he had dark hair like Wilhelmina and the same steady dark eyes that Walter had, which meant he was going to be, his mother assessed with objective maternal clarity, an exceptionally good-looking child. Walter came in when Dorothea opened the door for him, and he stood at the edge of the room and looked at his wife and his son, with an expression that Wilhelmina would think about for the rest of her life, when she wanted to remember what it felt like to be completely and unambiguously at the right place at the right time. He sat beside her and looked at the baby with the careful, amazed attention of a man encountering something genuinely new, and she watched him look, and she held his hand, and outside the January wind was doing what January winds in Kansas do, and inside the lamp was warm and the room was full of the specific silence of a life expanding. "What do you want to name him?" she asked. Walter considered this with the seriousness he brought to genuine questions. "I thought," he paused, "what do you think about James for your father?" He remembered the conversation from months ago when she had mentioned her father's name in passing and he had, characteristically, held on to it. She looked at him. "You remembered that?" "I remembered everything you said," he told her, without making it a grand statement, simply as a fact. "I always did." She looked down at the boy, who had the concentrated, urgent expression of a newborn working out the fundamental circumstances of existence. "James Donnelly," she said. "Yes, that's right." Dorothea, from the corner where she was doing the practical things that needed doing in the aftermath of birth, made a sound that was not quite a sob and not quite a laugh, but contained elements of both. The winter passed gently. James Donnelly was, from the beginning, a person of strong opinions and steady nerves, which his mother found entirely appropriate, and which his father met with the patient, amused equanimity that was one of his defining traits. He slept in the northeast room that Walter had built in the autumn, which had turned out beautifully properly lit, snug against the cold, with a window that faced east toward the morning. Caldwell in 1885 was evolving, as frontier towns did, toward something that was beginning to look more settled than wild. The cattle drives were changing, the railheads were extending, and the trail north was less necessary than it had been a decade before. New families were coming in, and the character of the town was shifting from purely transient to something more rooted. There were more children in the schoolhouse, which had been expanded, and more women in the church, and the general density of permanence was increasing in a way that Wilhelmina, who had chosen permanence as her mode from the beginning, found satisfying. She and Walter talked about the future with the easy practicality of two people who had both been thinking about the long game for a long time. The cattle operation was doing well. They had good stock and a growing reputation for reliable beef that was getting them favorable prices at the railhead markets. The kitchen garden had expanded to a commercial scale, with enough production in the summer months to sell regularly to Marcus Webb and the hotel, which provided a useful supplementary income. They were building something that would last, and both of them knew it, and the knowing of it was its own daily satisfaction. Walter bought Wilhelmina a good mare in the spring of 1885, a chestnut with a white blaze named Fortune, who had the intelligent, steady temperament of a horse that knows its own worth. It was the kind of gift that worked on multiple levels at once: practical, beautiful, and also a statement about the life they were making together, a life in which she had her own horse and her own pace and her own ground to cover. She rode Fortune out across the combined property on an April morning, with James strapped to her front in the carrier that Dorothea had made, because at 3 months old James had already communicated clearly that he found motion preferable to stillness, and the movement of the horse suited him. She rode the full perimeter of the property, 62 acres, in the spring light, and she thought about all of it: the fence line in October, the coffee in the kitchen, the blizzard and the barn lamp, the grave in April and the hand at the graveside, the lemonade in June and the yes in September, and the wedding in the little church and the room in the northeast corner and the boy against her chest. She stopped at the top of a small rise on the east end, the Connors' land, Walter's land, their land, and looked out at the whole of it in the morning sun. The stock pond caught the light. The cattle were scattered across the pasture in the peaceful way of animals that are well fed and unstressed. The house was visible, its roof solid against the sky, smoke coming from the kitchen chimney. Walter was somewhere beyond it, doing the morning work, and she could see the distant figure of him near the barn, and the sight of it settled in her chest with the same warmth that had been building there since October of 1882 and had not diminished by 1 degree. She had broken her vow. She had broken it with full knowledge and full choice and full attention to what she was doing, and she had been completely, specifically right to do so. The vow had been real, and the breaking of it had been real, and both of those things were true at the same time, and she was old enough and honest enough and had been through enough to hold that complexity without discomfort. She had been afraid, and she had done it anyway, which was, she had come to believe, the most accurate definition of courage that existed. Not the absence of fear. The doing of the thing while the fear is present and acknowledged and respected, and simply not allowed to be the final word. James shifted against her chest and made a small sound, and Fortune shifted beneath her, patient and warm. The spring sky was enormous over Kansas, the way skies are only over flat open land where there is nothing to interrupt the full arc of it, and it was the blue of something specific and known and utterly right. She turned Fortune toward home. In the years that followed, the Donnelly property became something that people in Caldwell referenced with a particular quality of regard. Not envy exactly, but a recognition that it represented a certain kind of successful life, built by two people who had each come to it with their own histories and their own hard-earned understanding of how things worked, and who had combined those histories into something that was more than either of them could have made alone. Walter was elected to Caldwell's town council in 1886, which he approached with the same steady practicality he brought to everything. He had opinions about the infrastructure improvements the town needed and expressed them clearly and without self-importance, which made him more effective than the men who came to the council with more performance and less substance. Wilhelmina attended the meetings when she could, and sometimes she had sharper things to say about the matters under discussion than anyone at the table, and Walter encouraged this unreservedly, which was one of the things she loved about him most, his complete lack of the particular smallness that some men showed when the women in their lives were more capable than was comfortable. James, at 2 years old, was thoroughly himself curious and tenacious and fond of following Walter around the property in the solemn imitation of everything his father did, which Walter treated with a gravity that was both genuine and lightly amused. By 3, he knew the names of all the cattle. By 4, he was deeply invested in the well-being of the kitchen garden in a way that had resulted in him watering things, earnestly and repeatedly, whether they needed it or not. Dorothea came by every Friday still, as she had for years, and the quality of those Friday mornings' coffee at the kitchen table, conversation ranging freely across everything from practical to personal to philosophical, was one of the steady pleasures of Wilhelmina's life. Dorothea's husband, Henry Phelps, was still alive and still stubborn and still the occasion of Dorothea's most entertaining stories, and the friendship between the two women was the kind that had been tested by time and was therefore unambiguous in its value. Marcus Webb retired from the general store in 1887 and handed it over to his nephew, a young man named Davis Webb, who was considerably less well-informed about everyone's business, but made up for it in organizational competence. Caldwell was becoming a proper town, with a school that now had 2 teachers and a church that had been expanded, and a new bank, and a doctor's office that Dr. Farris ran with increasing efficiency, and some very good equipment that he had ordered from St. Louis. The second pregnancy was easier than the first in the physical sense, though the winter of 1887 was harsh, and there was a stretch in February when Wilhelmina was confined to the house by a combination of weather and sensible precaution that she found deeply annoying and managed by reorganizing the house's storage systems and writing an extremely comprehensive letter to her sister in Missouri, whom she saw rarely but corresponded with regularly. The baby was born in March, and she was a girl, a daughter that Wilhelmina had, in the honest privacy of her own mind, been hoping for without quite saying so, because she had a name ready that she had been holding for years, since the early days of her first marriage, a name she had always intended for a daughter. Walter knew about the name she had told him in the 6th month, in the easy way they talked about things that mattered, and when the girl arrived, healthy and loud and dark-haired like James before her, he looked at Wilhelmina and said, "Clara." "Clara," she said. "Yes." Clara Donnelly was, from the first weeks, different from her brother in every way, quieter, more observational, the kind of baby who watched things with a focused intensity that people found slightly unnerving, as though she was taking notes. Walter said she reminded him of her mother, which Wilhelmina took as both accurate and complimentary. James, at 3, received the information of a sister with the measured consideration of a child who has not yet decided whether this development is favorable. And then, on the day Clara came home, sat beside her with the same solemn attention he gave to the cattle, and said, "Hello, Clara," with such gravity that Dorothea was obliged to leave the room briefly. By the spring of 1888, the Donnelly property was one of the most productive operations in the Caldwell area: 60 head of cattle, the expanded kitchen garden, a small apple orchard that Walter had planted along the south fence line 2 years earlier, and that was only now beginning to come into real production, and the supplementary income from the Aldridges, who were still renting the Connors' house and had become, over the years, close enough to friends that they were regularly at the Donnelly table for Sunday dinner. Wilhelmina was 38 years old in 1888. She stood at the window of her kitchen on a morning in May. Her kitchen, the one she had built and rebuilt and expanded, with its good stove and its long table that could seat 8 comfortably, and its herbs drying on the beams and its smell of bread and coffee, and the specifically domestic history of years of good mornings. And she looked at the land that was hers and Walter's and the children's, and she took the complete inventory of her life with the honesty she applied to everything. Thomas Grady. 7 months of a young woman's first love, gone in an October field. Still real, still present in her in the specific shape of who she had been and who that love had made her. Clement Hayward. 18 months of a steady good man, gone in a spring fever, still real, still present in the patience she had learned and the groundedness she had built in those years. The vow at the cold April grave, the wall she had built, the wall she had needed, the fence line in October, and a man with his hat in his hands and a practical conversation about a practical problem, and everything that had come after that, slowly and honestly and with full attention to every step. James at the kitchen table, 3 years old, explaining to Clara that the spoon went in the bowl, not on the floor, with the air of someone providing a genuine public service. Walter's coffee, still excellent, always present. The scar on the outside of his right hand, which she had eventually asked about and which turned out to be from a barbed wire incident in Colorado, a story he told with the dry, understated humor he sometimes produced, and that she still found, years later, reliably effective. 60 acres of productive land and 60 cattle and an apple orchard 3 years from full yield. Every vow she had broken. Every vow she was glad she had broken. She heard boots on the porch, and the door opened, and Walter came in for the mid-morning coffee that had been a fixed point in their days since before they were married, and he had hay in his hair because he had been in the barn, and he did not notice it, which meant she would not tell him until she was ready to, which she had discovered was one of the small, persistent pleasures of married life, the accumulation of little things you knew about another person that were entirely yours. He poured himself coffee and looked at her at the window. "What are you looking at?" "Everything," she said. He came to stand beside her and they looked out together at the May morning, the apple trees along the south fence, small but real, the cattle grazing, the kitchen garden in its first spring growth, the sky doing the enormous Kansas sky thing it did best on clear blue mornings. "We should put a fence section along the north pasture this summer," he said. "I've been meaning to address that." "I know," she said. "I was thinking the same thing." He looked at her with the not-quite smile that had been one of the first things she noticed about him, and that had never, in all the years of seeing it, become anything less than entirely its own thing. "You generally are," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder for a moment, and his arm went around her in the easy way of long practice, and they stood at the window and looked at everything they had made: the land and the children and the days and the life, all of it real, all of it earned, none of it easy, all of it completely, absolutely worth it. She had buried 2 men she had loved. She had stood at 2 graves and she had felt the full, honest weight of both losses, and she had carried those losses with her because that was how loss worked. It did not leave. It became part of the structure. It built into you and made you more complicated and more real. She had made a vow from the most honest place she knew, from the place where she had genuinely reached her own limit and could see no further. And then Walter Donnelly had knocked on her door with his hat in his hands and a conversation about fence lines, and something in her that she had believed was finished had proven that it was not finished at all, was, in fact, not even diminished, was simply waiting, the way seeds wait in frozen ground, for the specific conditions that would allow it to become what it was always capable of being. She had been afraid, and she had done it anyway. She had broken every vow. And on a May morning in 1888, with her husband's arm around her and her children in the next room and 60 acres of Kansas land in front of her, she was as certain as she had ever been of anything in her life that breaking those vows was the most courageous and most right and most honest thing she had ever done. The morning light moved across the land in the way of all Kansas mornings, wide and clean, and indifferent to human concerns in the best possible way, simply existing, simply continuing, the way the land continued, and the way good things continued when they were built from honest materials and maintained with care. Clara called from the next room for her mother, and Wilhelmina straightened and went to her, and Walter went back out to the work of the morning, and the day continued in the way of all good days, full and real and thoroughly, completely alive.